Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to tackle a question that everyone asks at some point or another during their friendship bracelet making journey, and it is by far the most asked question I've been asked personally, that I've seen on bracelet making forums, and that I get asked on, like Instagram and in person, that sort of thing. And that is, how do I figure out the length of my strings? And most people don't have a proper answer, but today I'm going to show you the formula I came up with that is tested and true to determine how long your strings need to be, and then I'm going to tell you what I actually do. So before I put this massive formula up on the screen, I'm going to walk you through this step by step, so don't be intimidated by it when you see it. We're going to break it down every little step of the way and do the math together. So what you will need for this is, first things first, of course, your string of choice. I would recommend using whatever string it is that you normally make your bracelets with. For me, that is embroidery floss. This embroidery floss came from Walmart, I do believe. It's not really anything special. You can get it at Walmart, you can get it at Michael's. Pretty much any craft store is going to have embroidery floss, even some sewing stores. So embroidery floss is obviously number one. Second, you're gonna need something to mount your bracelet with. I use safety pins. Some people use tape, some people use clipboards. I find safety pins work best for me, so that's what I intend to use today. You're also gonna need scissors to cut that string, hopefully at the perfect length by the time this video is done. You will also need a pen of some description. You could use a marker, but I think it might bleed too much, so I would definitely suggest using a pen. For the sake of this video, I'm going to try and use this Sharpie pen. It's not a permanent marker, but it's black, and I think it will translate better on screen, so hopefully it doesn't bleed on us too much. You will also need a ruler and or a tape measure, and this is very important for this. You'll probably want a piece of paper on hand, that's up to you, just so you can write your numbers down so you don't have to do this every single time. And then last but not least, you're going to need your pattern you're going to make. For this video, we're just gonna make this simple arrowhead pattern. So I'm not going to pull up an actual pattern. I'm gonna count from here and do the math all based on what I see here. So now I'm going to show you our formula. So as you can see, our formula is opening bracket, length of string and proper knots, times the number of knots in color Y, closing bracket, plus open bracket, physical size of finished knot, times all the knots color Y passes under, closing bracket, plus length of desired ties, plus open bracket, overhand knot times 2, close bracket, plus length of string for physical loop, plus length of string after final knot equals your perfect string length. So to start this formula, you're going to need to know your order of operations. Because friendship bracelets is such a large range, an age group of people working on it, I'm going to explain this really quick. You may know it as bed mass, you may know it as ped mass. There's a few different variations of it. I was taught as bed mass, so that's how I'm going to explain it here. So the order of operations is the order you do the math in an equation to get the correct answer. So bed mass stands for B for brackets, E for exponents, D for division, M for multiplication, A for addition, and S for subtraction. So we're going to look at that, and the first thing is brackets. So anything in a bracket is the first part of math we need to tackle. So let's break it down bracket by bracket. First, I'm gonna say, grab your string that isn't particularly, special to you. I would suggest something light. This is going to be just tester string that we're going to check our measure off of. You're going to mark it up with your pen. So don't use like your favorite colors. I would use some of your least used colors is probably your best and safest bet. So to make the measurements for all these knots, the first thing we're going to do to get started in filling out this equation is we need to actually take a measurement of something that we have not yet come into on our pattern. So what you're going to do, keeping in mind that this is for the absolute basic. If you are doing any kind of fancy ties, you're going to need to add more into the strings and, you know, do your knots and stuff and how you're going to do it. So how I'm showing you now is going to be a different length than say this, okay? This has knots around it, then you have to measure all of that string around it. I'm just showing you a basic, you know, loop it, braid it off bracelet here and how to find the string length of it. You can, of course, adjust for whatever your favorite ending is. So what you're gonna do is you're going to make an overhand knot, how you tie your loop at the start of your bracelet, and try to make it generally the size that you aim for most of the time. So this is approximately the size I would normally aim for. So what I'm going to do now is with my marker, I don't want to do it on the fabric here, I'm going to mark as close to the top of this knot as I possibly can. Also mark at the bottom of the knot here, as close to it as you can. It's a little bit awkward holding this trying to do it, but that'll work. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to untie this and we're going to measure. So right now what we are measuring for is actually later in the pattern, but I'm gonna show you how to do it now so we don't have to undo a whole bunch of knots later. So right now what we'll be measuring for is the length of the desired loop, and then we'll be the overhand knot length. So we're going to go ahead and untie this now that we have marked at the top of our knot or the bottom of our loop and underneath that knot or the top of where our bracelet would start. So let's go ahead and unknot that. So as we can see here, these marks went a little awry, but we're gonna open this up. So this is what we are looking at. So now we're going to take our measuring tape and I'm going to measure. We can see here that our first mark was here and first mark was here. Because this is so long, I know that this is the loop of our bracelet. So I'm gonna go ahead and measure my loop here is 4 centimeters. So I'm gonna go ahead and write that down for later. So then this was part of our loop, which means this mark here is going to be the amount of string that was in our overhand knot. So now I'm going to use my measuring tape or your ruler, whichever you have, and we're going to measure that length. And that length for me is 2 centimeters. Now these measurements will be slightly different for everyone depending on how tight or loose you normally knot. So using my measurements may give you somewhat of an idea, but it might not be exact to how you knot. Okay, so now we can go ahead and we can just tie this back up. Now that we've got that out of the way, we're gonna jump into the first bracket. So our first bracket is, as a reminder, opening bracket, length of string in proper knots, times the number of knots in color Y, closing bracket. Okay, so what we're going to do now is you're going to, like I said, this is why you want it to be light colored string because you're doing all this marking. You're gonna go ahead and start knotting. It really doesn't matter what kind of pattern you do. I'm just gonna do diagonal stripe for the sake of these because that's a really quick pattern. I can bang that out really quick, and I know that when I make that pattern, I'm generally pretty consistent and my knots are all like good size. My bracelets turn out straight. That's a good one to go with. Don't try and do this with like some weird pattern that you know yourself have made previously that like your edges get wavy and stuff that you've got issues with. Do something basic for this. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna go ahead and make just a couple starter lines of your pattern. This is just to even it out. If you start with a clipboard, you might be able to get away with immediately measuring, but for me, your first couple rows of knots after your main knot here are generally not always straight and can kind of be skewed a bit. So the reason we're gonna do a couple lines first is just to make sure that we're getting an accurate measurement. We don't want to do all this math and then find out that our numbers were wrong. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to take the measurements for your first bracket. So the first part of the bracket is the length of string in a proper knot. I just use the terminology proper knot because it's for like a stitch. So it could be a forwards knot, a backwards knot, or a forwards backwards knot, or a backwards forwards knot. As long as you are consistent with your gauge, it won't matter what kind of knot you measure. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to take our knotting string and we are going to draw a line as close to the bottom of the knotted row we just did. So I just marked our yellow string here, which will be our knotting string for this row, just underneath the purple here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and knot around the orange string, which is our second string here, as I would normally do my forwards knots. There we go. Okay, now I'm going to do this again. I'm going to mark as close to the side of the knot that I just made. Sorry, I'm gonna try and move that out of the way a bit so you can see what I'm doing. I don't know if that's helping though. As close to the side of the knot as you can. There we go, that's a bit better. Of the knot we just made. So still marking that yellow string, just as close to the side of the yellow knot we just made. Now I'm gonna do this probably 2 more times, so I have 3 and I can measure and make sure my numbers are consistent. So there we go. And I'm gonna mark right up against that knot there. Okay. And this is just so I can make sure I'm accurate. So if there is any difference, I can either, you know, measure it out, average it out. But right now, I'm just trying to mark. It's probably not a great day for me to be doing this because I literally haven't made a bracelet in over a year. So my knots might not be super consistent right now, but we're going with it anyways. Okay, so now I technically have 3 knots marked out here. So I'm gonna go ahead and do the most tedious part. And this is why I don't do this very often, because when I lose my numbers, you have to go through all of this to figure out the formula. But we're gonna flip this over and we're going to untie this. So now that I've got that untied, your marks on your string should tell you about how long the string in your knots is. So we're gonna get our measuring tape out again. And let's see, okay, so there's our first mark. And obviously I can't read from 1, so I'm gonna read from 5 here, 0.5. So I'm gonna go ahead and say that 0.5 is likely my average length of string in a regular stitch. So 0.5 centimeters. Now if you're, I don't know, in the States, I don't think you would use centimeters, but just make sure that all your measurements you're consistent with. So if you're measuring in centimeters, all of your measurements need to be in centimeters. If you're measuring in millimeters, all of your measurements need to be in millimeters. If you want to measure in inches, everything has to be in inches. Just make sure you are consistent. Okay, so now we have the length of string in our proper knots, which for me was 0.5 centimeters. And we need to multiply it by the number of knots in color Y. So now we need to pull out our pattern. For me, I'm doing this arrowhead pattern. And color Y is whatever color you are searching for this length. So for a pattern like this, they're all going to be the same. That's why I picked this pattern, because it's easy. I can just punch the number in over and over again instead of solving for every single string. So for this pattern, let's go for this, let's go for the pinky red color here. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 times that color, that a row appears of that color in my pattern. Because this is a repeating pattern, I can figure out how many knots are in one row of my red, and then just multiply it by the number of rows that show up in my pattern. So looking at our pattern here, I'll use my pen because it's fine point. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so we have 7 knots. So because we have 7 knots in one row and we have 17 rows, we'll just do the math on that, and that will tell us how many knots are in our pattern of our red pink color. So for the sake of this, I have 84 red knots in my pattern. So I'm going to use that and punch it into my formula. So now, using my measurements, you'll of course insert yours. Our first bracket is going to look something like this. Opening bracket, 0.5 centimeters times 84, closing bracket. Our second bracket, remembering we have to follow the order of operations, so we have to solve for every bracket first. So our second bracket is opening bracket, physical size of finished knot, times all knots color Y passes under, closing bracket. So now we're going to use the same kind of method as before, marking and measuring. And we need to find the physical size of a finished knot. This is not the length of string that is in it, but this is the actual size of our knot. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our marker and we're going to draw a line along the bottom as close as we can to this row of that we've just knotted. So I'm going to go ahead and draw my line as close to the bottom of it as I can. Now we're going to tie a row of knots. You don't have to do the whole row. You can do part of a row, that's fine. I would just suggest doing a few knots again for accuracy. So I'm just gonna do 3. And now I'm gonna take my pen and I'm going to mark as close as I can to the bottom of those 3 knots I just did along these strings here. Just like that. And now we're going to untie them. Okay, so now that we've undone that, you're going to want to measure between these marks. So that's our knotting string, so we don't want to look at that. What we're measuring is between our line at the bottom of our knots here and this line. And it is teeny tiny. It'll be like a millimeter. Let's see here. Yes, 1 millimeter, which is not 1 millimeter because we used centimeters before. So it's 0.1 centimeters. Now we need to know all the knots that our color, our red color, remember from our pattern, passes under. So for this, if you're looking at your pattern on like an actual pattern from like Bracelet Book or friendshipbracelets.net, I don't know, maybe Pinterest or whatever, you're going to be able to kind of see it all much easier. For me, I'm going to have to kind of visualize where it all goes. So when we make a chevron pattern, our red string is gonna go across all of these. I'm just gonna meet in the middle. And then it's going to go under here. And then it's going to go under here and under here until it's back here. So, remembering that this is a repeating pattern, we can just count for one section of our pattern, multiply it by the number of times it shows up in our pattern. So for me, so it was 1, 2, 3, and 4. So in one segment of our pattern, our repeating pattern, our red goes under 4 knots. So now, because we counted before that there are 17 repetitions of our pattern here, we know that we need to multiply that by 17. So using my measurements, my second bracket now looks like this. Opening bracket, 0.1 centimeters times 68, closing bracket. So now we move on to our third and final bracket in our formula, which is an overhand knot times 2. Now, if you remember those measurements I made you take at the very, very beginning that I said we'd use later, we're gonna use them now. So the overhand knot is this knot here. Not a pattern knot, this one. And the reason we want it times 2 is because we use one here, and then generally when you tie this off, you're gonna braid it and you're gonna put another one at the bottom. So we need to know that length, and it needs to be in the formula twice. So going back to the very first part of our measurements here, 2 centimeters was what I measured my string length to be in my overhand knot. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna stick that in there right now. Of course, if you didn't do this at the beginning, you didn't measure that, you can still grab all these strings together, tie your knot, mark the top, mark the bottom, and untie it and measure it. So now our last bracket with my measurements says opening bracket, 2 centimeters times 2, closing bracket. So now with all those numbers in our brackets, our formula should look something like this. Opening bracket, 0.5 centimeters times 84, closing bracket, plus opening bracket, 0.1 centimeters times 68, closing bracket, plus length of desired ties, plus opening bracket, 2 centimeters times 2, closing bracket, plus length of string for physical loop, plus length of string after final knot equals the perfect string length. So now we've done all of our brackets, we need to add in our numbers for just those punch-in things, the things that aren't in brackets. So your fill-ins, if you will. So the first one is you need to measure how long your ties are or your braids at the end. Again, this is for, showing you this for a basic braid. If you're doing something like this, you're going to need to figure out and measure how long your string is for your typical tie off. For me though, we are just doing a braid. So I'm just gonna go ahead and braid and kind of see how long I normally make my tails. I feel like that's about how long I normally make my tails. So since that is already marked at the bottom of that row, I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna mark off the bottom of my ties here. Just like that. Undo that braid and you guessed it, you're gonna measure it. From the bottom of that row down to here is 11 centimeters. We already measured the string in our starting loop. That was the other measurement I had you take earlier. So mine was 4 centimeters. And that measurement does not include your overhand knot. And then you want to measure your string after your final ties. How much you leave after you tie off your ties, this little chunk here. So I feel like this is pretty average for how much I leave. So I'm just going to go ahead and measure off of this one from the bottom of this knot here. I leave, we'll call it 1.5 centimeters. Now, from experience, you are not going to be able to tie this final knot very well with that little amount of string. So depending on how well you are at tying your knots with how much string you normally can deal with, I would suggest maybe adding a centimeter on here, which is what I'm going to do. So I'm going to, despite that being 1.5 centimeters that I just measured, I know I'm not going to be able to tie that final knot with that little amount of string. So I'm gonna call it 2.5 centimeters. And now let's take a look at our formula. So now our formula looks like this. Opening bracket, 0.5 centimeters times 84, closing bracket, plus opening bracket, 0.1 centimeters times 68, closing bracket, plus 11 centimeters, plus opening bracket, 2 centimeters times 2, closing bracket, plus 4 centimeters, plus 2.5 centimeters equals your perfect string length. So now we're gonna follow the rest of our order of operations. So we've just done all of our brackets, okay? Now we need to do the math that's in those brackets first. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're going to look at our first bracket, which is opening bracket 0.5 centimeters times 84. So you're gonna wanna go 84 times 0.5, which is 42. Our second bracket is 0.1 centimeters, or sorry, opening bracket. Our second bracket is opening bracket 0.1 centimeters times 68, closing bracket, which is 6.8. And our third set of brackets is opening bracket 2 centimeters times 2, closing bracket, which is 4. So now that we have these numbers, we can go to the next step. There are no exponents in our equation. That's, you know, those little numbers up top if you have like to the power of. We don't have any of those in our equation, so we can skip over that one. Next is division. We don't have any division in our equation either. So moving along, we've done B, E, D, M for multiplication. We do have some multiplication in our equation, but it was all within our brackets, so we've already tackled that. Next is addition, which is all we have left. So now we add things together. So we're looking at 42 plus 6.8 plus 11 centimeters plus 4 plus 4 plus 2.5. So 42 plus 6.8 is 48.8. And because I'm not good at math, I'm going to do this one step at a time. So now 48.8 plus 11 is 59.8. The equation now looks like 59.8 plus 4 plus 4 plus 2.5. 59.8 plus 4 is 63.8, and now plus 4 plus 2.5. And 63.8 plus 4 is 67.8 plus 2.5. So 67.8 plus 2.5 equals 70.3. Remembering that we did all our measurements in centimeters, so that is our final perfect string length, 70.3 centimeters for our arrowhead pattern. All right, guys, that is all. I think I have covered everything. If you do have any difficulties with it though, or you do have any questions, please feel free to ask. If you like this video and you want more tips and tricks and questions answered about bracelets, also let me know. Give this video a like so I know you enjoyed this and it was helpful. Otherwise, I will see you guys all next time. Bye.